Hello, beautiful people, and welcome, to Ask Zajef Wanderer Edition. Woo! I'm not entirely sure if my editors are going to have enough time to put this video out before the banner comes out, so it's very possible that the video is coming a little bit late. If that's the case, I'm very sorry. The Kokomi one is going to be even later. I'm very sorry about that. That is entirely my fault, not my editor's fault. I am the one who has been procrastinating on recording this. In any case, let's move on and get started with the Ask Zajef Wanderer Edition. What is his overall place in the meta? What is his pull value, especially compared to the other 3.85 stars? And how much has changed with him since his first banner over half a year ago? I'm going to start with that last question because I think it's the easiest to answer. Not much. The main thing that has changed is Faruzan was given for free in one of the recent events, and she's now been out for a while and a potential unit you can get from the standard banner for a while, which means that instead of approaching this banner with everyone with a C-1 Faruzan, just none whatsoever, everyone is approaching this banner with, if you've done the event that rewarded the free Faruzan, which I definitely did. Totally didn't just not do it at all. Shut up. If you got your free Faruzan, you're going into it with at least C0 Faruzan, and if you've gotten her either from losing your rate up 50/50s on banners in the past, or just from getting her from the limited banner, or the standard banner, it's possible you have C1, C2, C3. Fuck, maybe you might even have C6 without it never ever pulling on a banner that has Faruzan as a rate up on it, although that's probably not very likely. But point is here, the expected amount of Faruzan constellations that you're gonna have is higher. And that actually does change things for Wanderer a lot, because the main thing about going for vertical investment on Wanderer is that his constellations aren't very good, but going pretty deep into his banner can still be beneficial for him because you're going for C6 Faruzan. And so people having more Faruzans going into his banner makes it so that getting to that power level that you can expect from a C0, 1, or 2 Wanderer with a C6 Faruzan is going to take you on average less wishes, which is something that he has going for him compared to his previous banner. That being said, the average number of wishes it's going to take you to get a C6 4 stars is cool and all, but because there's no pity system, there is a lot of variance. I remember doing some testing on an account that had C2 Ito and no Goro. There's a lot of variance with 4-star wishes. If you're going into it intending to wish until you get C6, you're gonna have to be ready for the possibility that it might take you 500-600 wishes if you get unlucky. In any case, his pull value is fairly mediocre. He has a few things going for him, but in terms of actual damage output, with C6 Faruzan, he's pretty good. He's got some teams that are somewhat comparable with good meta teams. Without C6 Faruzan, I don't think I would really recommend him that much, but that's only from a damage perspective. He does have a few things going for him outside of that, namely he's not burst reliant, which makes it very easy to deal with multi-wave stuff. His teams aren't really setup reliant, which means that when you are in multi-wave stuff, you don't have to swap out of him to redo your setup against the new wave. You can just keep attacking. Obviously he can fly, so enemies that can fly are less of a pain in the ass. People tend to like him a lot as an overall unit, so he still has a bunch of things that are in his favor, even if he's not necessarily the most important character to go for. That being said, he has also got some things working against him, and that's mainly how garbage he is in AoE situations. There are some AoE situations where he's not terrible, but his charge attack, it's an auto-targeted ability that is always going to have its center onto one enemy. What that means is that because it has a pretty high amount of stagger, the enemies around that enemy are going to be pushed away, which means that it's very difficult to keep groups of enemies grouped up. And that's one of the many issues that Wanderer has that can get somewhat alleviated by having C6 Faruzan, because obviously C6 Faruzan makes her group a little bit, and that kind of makes up for it. It doesn't completely eliminate the issue. It will still be there because Wanderer will charge attack more often than Faruzan will pull enemies together, but it does help a lot in alleviating it. His normal attacks obviously have very small AoE, so when you're in AoE situations, he's generally not the greatest option, especially because there's another character who basically works almost the exact same way as he does in terms of his team building, and who actually is pretty good at AoE, has a much larger AoE, and you can control where your stagger goes, which is Xiao. All of that being said though, Wanderer is a fairly good example of a hyper carry who is balanced like hyper carries should be, which is he's not unplayable without vertical investment, but he's also far from being impressive. But he does scale fairly well with vertical investments, with getting really good artifacts for him, getting Faruzan C6, getting his signature, all that good stuff. It's not the kind of gameplay that I'm really interested in, right? Like, I make it pretty clear in my videos that I enjoy the game more when I can play a lot of different teams and, you know, switch it up all the time. And if I go for Constellations on 5-star characters, if I go for signature weapons on 5-star characters, I'll have less characters to play. And that does seem to be within my audience what the majority of people tend to like as well. But obviously, when I say the majority, I'm not saying 99%. I'm saying like over half. But there's still a significant portion of people who don't need to be switching up the team they play all the time, who just want to play one character and build them up to be able to play them everywhere and never have to change their teams. And if that's what you're looking for, Wanderer can actually be a fairly good unit to go for. Is he going to be the best hyper carry to go for? I don't think so, but he's definitely a completely reasonable one. His overall place on the meta, I just summarize it as all right. Actually, especially compared, I didn't compare him to the other 3.85 stars. So first part is easy. I consider him to be a lot better of a unit than both of these. Klee isn't terrible, right? She's actually fairly good in monopyro teams, but monopyro teams are not really that reliant on the unit that, like the slot in the team that she takes. They're more reliant on the other 3 units. Not that she's not doing a good portion of the team's damage, but more so that the slot that she's taking, a lot of units can fulfill. And even when they're not quite as good at it, they're still not that far behind. So that kind of makes her value kind of whatever in a lot of the teams. And then also, spoilers for 4.0, I guess, but we have Lenny coming up, which is going to challenge her even more for the monopyro slot. That being said, compared to Kokomi, it's not nearly as clear cut. I think that Kokomi is a significantly stronger pull in terms of like team versatility and where she can be used. But I definitely can see a world where if you're planning on going for vertical investment, planning on going for C6 Faruzan, for his signature weapon, for some of his constellations, where you'd actually get better results out of going for Wanderer than going for Kokomi. All in all, I'd still recommend Kokomi over him, but at the end of the day, right, which character ends up being in general more meta is only one of the many factors that go into the decision of whether or not you want to roll for a character. So if that's not the only thing you're looking for, if that's not the main thing you're looking for, don't let that screw with your decision too much. Next up, do I think he's a relatively future-proof, especially relative to Kokomi, who's on the same banner? I mean, I kinda. Like, his niche, I guess, is he's an anemo carry with some upsides relating to dealing with annoying enemies and overall exploration. Are there gonna be other animal carries in the future? Probably at some point, although I don't see that happening in the near future, at the very least. Are they also gonna be good at overworld stuff? Probably not as good as him. Are there gonna be good overworld characters? Definitely. Are they gonna fit the same archetypes as he does? Probably not. I talk about this fairly often, but the concept of future-proof is just, Hoyo can always just decide to come out with the exact same character, but with numbers twice as big, and completely invalidate a character like Wanderer. And obviously this is an exaggeration, but the point that I'm trying to drive home is just, there's no such thing as an objectively future-proof unit. It's always going to boil down to what Hoyo wants to do with their characters. What are some of his strengths and weaknesses relative to the other dedicated on-field carries, especially the likes of Xiao and Ito? I mean, let's start with Xiao, because he's obviously the closest to Xiao. He's often played in almost the same teams. His main strength is just that he's better at dealing with annoying enemies, right? Enemies that fly a lot, enemies that move a lot, enemies that have periods where you can't hit them, so you can't generate energy. The Wanderer is generally better at dealing with that because he's not burst reliant. His attacks can hit enemies that are flying. His attacks have range. And then when it comes to like the situations where he's outshined by Xiao, AoE situations in general, enemies that aren't annoying, right? Just in terms of straight up damage, if the enemies have a hitbox that Xiao can collision plunge, Xiao just does more damage. That's kind of it. I'd say that like in terms of power, I'd rate them both at around as strong as each other. Cause like I'd say that Xiao is a little bit stronger, but Wanderer has a little bit more versatility. But they're strong in different situations and they're versatile in different ways. The kind of situations that Wanderer is good at dealing with are different than the kinds of situations that Xiao is good at dealing with. Compared to Ito, Ito's such a hard character to judge. The power of his themes depends so much on what you have around him, and because the units you want to be putting in his teams are not units like Bennett and like they're not generally the greatest units outside of his teams, then you're kind of in a situation where you've got the upside that if you do have the units, it gives you more freedom for your other team, but you have the downside where you need to have the units. Personally, I find Ito more fun to play than Wanderer, especially Korean Ito. Korean Ito's voice just makes me happy when he does the final plunge attack in his sequence. It's just amazing. So if I had to choose between the two of them, I'd probably always go for Ito, but it's still similar to the Xiao situation. Like, they're good at like slightly different things. Between the three of those characters, I'd say that their power is close enough that you should just go for whichever one has the playstyle or characterization that appeals the most to you. Just how reliant is he on Faruzan anyway, and how necessary / impactful is for C6 for him? If you want to have his actual like good teams, they're almost always going to include a C6 Faruzan. If you're not looking at C6 Faruzan, his best teams don't even always include Faruzan. Faruzan's just not that strong of a unit at a baseline. She's just okay, and you can play her and it's not going to be like a massive downgrade, but a lot of the time you should just use Oppa. He's fine even without Faruzan. Like, he's all right. He's just a bit more unimpressive. Is it ever advisable to put a C6 Faruzan on a more DPS-oriented build configuration over something like 4-piece Tenacity on a Wanderer team? Not really. Like, you can have a DPS-oriented build configuration while being on 4-piece Tenacity. Those are not mutually exclusive. But in the teams where you don't have 4-piece Tenacity on someone else, someone should be on it. And if your Faruzan is C6 and she can proc it reliably, it should probably be her. Oh, one of the upsides of TOM that I think people tend to forget a lot is that it doesn't just give you attack. It also gives you a lot of shield strength, which is gonna make it feel a lot more comfortable. Your shields are gonna take a lot more damage before they're destroyed. Speaking of Faruzan, how much ER does she generally want at C0, C4, and C6 when in a Wanderer Hyper team? It's gonna depend on whether or not you use your E. It's gonna depend on your exact rotation, whether you're feeding your Faruzan particle into herself or if you're feeding them into someone else. A good benchmark to go for at C0 is like sort your artifacts by ER, and anything that is available put on her with a 2-piece emblem. At C4 you have a little bit more freedom, but it's still kind of the same idea because her damage is just not really big enough to justify caring that much about the rest of the stats. And then at C6, with Fav, you barely even need any ER Sands anymore. Probably still worth going for, but at that point, Fav plus ER Sands is going to be more than enough ER. Would I say he's a versatile unit? In a way, he is. The thing is that Genshin combat can vary in a lot of different ways. You can be against a different number of enemies, you can be against a different type of enemies, some enemies that are staggerable, some enemies that are not, some enemies that group themselves just with their AI, like by manipulating it, and some enemies that will run away from you and from each other. But there's not that many characters that are good at dealing with every single type, and a Wanderer won't be able to deal with every single type. He does tend to struggle a bit more in AoE situations, but in terms of single target situations, he can deal with basically any of them, so he does have a certain amount of versatility, yeah. Realistically, how much of a combat benefit is his ability to hover above the ground? It's not. If his normal attacks were better at aiming up instead of him going up, he'd arguably be better. Depending on your height and how far away from the enemies you are, they can have different attack patterns, and enemies' range attack patterns tend to be a lot more punishing than enemies' melee attack patterns. So flying above the ground is very often more of a downside than an upside, although it can be an upside against some enemies. Like, for example, against Rift Hounds, it's an upside, but I definitely wouldn't call it a significant benefit. Talent overview, skill or auto first. Auto, 100%. Is his burst worth leveling before C2? I mean, yes. Like, you're not gonna leave your burst at level 1 because it's so cheap to level it a little bit. Is it important to level up as soon as you can? No, but as a general rule, unless it's a talent you just literally don't use, or it's like a normal attack for a character who just does normal attacks to proc so swords or stuff like that, there's never a reason not to level your talents, especially the early levels are so cheap that you basically always should, but it's definitely not that important. How would I rank the buffs he could get via his Ascension 1. The worst one is the Hydra one, because by the time you get to the like extra amount of time that you have because of the added stamina, most of your buffs have expired anyways, so your damage isn't really that high anymore. It's nice for finishing off enemies at the end, but it's just generally not that impactful. The Electro one is also fairly insignificant because his burst is not that important of a portion of his damage, and also because he doesn't tend to have Electro units in his teams all that often. The Cryo one is the best one, right? That's a lot of crit rate, but it's also not worth putting a Cryo unit on your team specifically for it. Like, the Cryo unit would need to also be good on the team at a baseline. And the Pyro one is not that far behind the Cryo one, but he actually has good synergy with a lot of Pyro units, which makes it so that while in a vacuum the Cryo buff is the strongest one, practically the Pyro one will be the one you're focused on the most. Artifact set overview: Desert Pavillon versus Echoes versus Shimenawas versus two-piece. Echoes is cringe. Obviously, if you have a really good Echoes set, you can go for it. Desert Pavillon is obviously quite good on him, but because so many characters are good with Emblem, a lot of people are gonna have a decent 4-piece Shimenawa set, and Shimenawas is also a fairly good option on him. There are situations where Shimenawas can actually be even better than his signature, right? This gives you 55 damage percent on your stuff. Shimenawas gives you 50%, but also 18% attack, and 18% attack is better than 5% damage percent. The total amount of damage, like stats you're gaining, is bigger from Shimenawas, but getting the attack speed in some situations will let you get one more attack in, and having your burst available more often can also be better. Again, it's just by the end of your burst, some of your buffs might have expired. So by the end of your skill, sorry, some of your buffs might have expired. So the burst won't always be that big of a deal, but it still can be in some situations. Sometimes you just want to use it to finish off an enemy. I just go with whichever set you have the best, or whichever set has the like best stats between the two. I would never actively farm Echoes for him. If you're looking for the chosen one unicorn elemental mastery goblet from the flop domain, then you might as well go for a good Pavillon set for your Wanderer at the same time. If instead you're a reasonable person who doesn't want to spend 6 months in the flop domain, you can stick to farming Emblem and get Shimenawas for him while you're doing that. How much ER does he want, if at all? His burst is generally not impactful enough that you want to be building enough ER to burst every rotation, because the amount of ER that you would need to burst every rotation is very high, and you'd have to sacrifice so many other stats for it that you're better off just going for a burst every other or every third rotation, or even just basically never with Shimenawas, and not worry about the ER at all. Can an attack goblet ever be advisable over an anemo damage bonus one for him? I wouldn't recommend it, no. At the end of the day, if you don't have an anemo goblet, or if you have a 50 CV attack goblet and a 6 CV anemo goblet with no attack subs, the attack goblet can be better, but it almost never will be. How impactful is attack speed on him? So a small amount of attack speed is completely useless, because his best combo at C0 is charge attack spam, and that doesn't really get increased by attack speed, which means that the only combo that you're improving is a suboptimal one. But if you stack enough attack speed with multiple different sources, with potentially his C1, with his signature weapon, with the Pavillon set, then it can reach the point where normal attacks are better than charge attacks, and then retroactively it makes it so that all of that attack speed becomes useful. But at a baseline, it's not that big of a deal. Weapon overview. How do all his weapons stack up against his best in slot? Do their rankings also depend on what combos he uses, and does he have any good free-to-play options? His weapon sucks because it's situationally a minor increase over other 5-star weapons. What it does is it pushes it over the line where normal attacks become better than charge attacks. And so basically, if you look at how much damage he's doing, if you're using charge attacks, his signature is significantly worse than other 5-star options. If you're using normal attacks, it's slightly better than other 5-star options that are doing charge attacks. The thing is, like I mentioned earlier, his general biggest weakness is AoE situations, and his normal attacks AoE is a joke, which means that having slightly less DPS, but actually AoE, and a lot better in AoE situations, generally tends to be better, which makes it so that in a lot of situations, his signature weapon is a downgrade over other 5-star options. Now, obviously, if you get his Constellations, that won't necessarily be the case anymore, but that is one thing to keep in mind. Outside of his best in slot, basically all of the 5-star catalysts that have relevant stats are pretty good on him. A tiny bit behind his signature if you're doing normal attacks on his signature and charge attacks on those weapons. And maybe surprisingly for some of you, Witzith is also not far behind. Like, in some situations, it is actually better than his 5-star options. Basically, when the buff is active, it can be. When the buff is not active, it's obviously a decent amount worse. But it does help with front-loading damage, which, if you're killing enemies in an odd number of rotations, will actually be a pretty huge deal, because with its 30-second cooldown, you'll have it active on your first uptime, and then on your second rotation, it's going to be less than 30 seconds, so it won't be active. The passive will still be on cooldown. And then on your third rotation, it'll be active again. So if you kill enemies in one rotation, it has 100% uptime. 2 rotations, 50% uptime. 3 rotations, well, now it's 2 out of 3, so 66.666% uptime. 4 rotations, back to 50. 5 rotations, it's 60%, so on and so forth. So basically, the less rotations, the better, especially if it's an odd number of rotations. But also front-loading damage helps in general with killing multiple waves of enemies, because it can help you kill the first wave more easily. And so even though it tends to cheat, like to be calculated, trailing a little bit behind the 5-star options, it often tends to be very competitive in practice. His best general free-to-play option is Dodoko Tails, but he also has some other fairly strong free-to-play options. Mapamari is not like that great for him because you don't really care about the EM that much, but because he gets so much attack percent, it having high base attack and low substat means that the EM substat is less of a downside, and it does have a decent passive, and it makes it not that much worse than Dodoko if you ended up missing on the event. But if you haven't made Mapamari yet, don't, because in 4.0 we're getting a new craftable weapon, and at a baseline it's about as good as Mapamari, but it has an effect where if you heal, it can give you additional damage percent. Obviously in Wanderer teams, if you're playing him with Bennett, which most like Abyss Wanderer teams do, Bennett only heals you if you're below 70% HP, so you won't necessarily be able to proc it. But even if you don't proc it, it's about as good as Mapamari, and if you do proc it, then it is significantly better and it becomes competitive with the 5-star options. A tiny little bit behind, but not that far. Now, in order to proc it, you need to basically get under 70% HP and then have Bennett heal you for what is basically 24% of your Wanderer's HP. What that means is that if you are going to be going for the upcoming weapon, because you ended up, or you started playing after the event that gave us Dodoko Tails, and you don't have Witzith or any of the 5-star options, and you're going for one of the craftable options, that's going to alter the way you want to build your Bennett. Because 24% of Wanderer's HP, assuming a whatever set with a few HP substats, but nothing too crazy, he's gonna be generally somewhere between 17 and 19k HP. 24% of that is somewhere between 4 and 5k health that you want to heal in one tick with Bennett. Now, a level 90 Bennett with a level 9 burst doesn't heal for that amount without building him for healing a little bit. He'll heal for like 3k or something per tick. But the thing is, if you go to like 65% HP and then you heal for 3k, you're back to like 85% HP, and you're just sitting there like, oh, I'm not healing anymore, so I just don't get the buff at all. Whereas if you actually build your Venom for healing, falling under 70% HP once can actually be enough to proc the passive. So basically, this might not be a necessary tangent to go on, but if you are planning on going for that craftable weapon for your Wanderer, maybe don't throw away healing bonus circlets from the Noblesse set. Because healing bonus circlet by itself generally should be enough to make your Bennett heal enough to proc it in only one healing tick. You only need to fall into under 70% HP once to get the bonus effect. That's obviously assuming a few HP subsets on your Bennett. You might also, if you have like no subsets whatsoever, need an HP% goblet. But with HP% goblet and healing bonus circlet, you're basically always going to be healing for enough to get it in only one tick. Alright, is charge attack spam, normal attack spam, or weaving charge attacks between normal attacks the way to go with his combos? And is it always advisable to capitalize on his A4? So using his A4 intentionally is always a DPS loss. Dashing will never make you do more damage than not dashing. The purpose of his A4 is to not punish you too hard if you have to dash to dodge an attack. It's not something that you want to be maximizing. It's only there so that you don't lose stamina for dashing and you don't lose too much damage for dashing. That's the main purpose of it. You should never really try to capitalize on it by itself. And is charge attack spam, normal attack spam, or weaving charge attacks with normal attacks the way to go? It kind of depends. Charge attack spam tends to be the most damage. Weaving charge attack, so N2C basically, tends to be a good mix of good damage and easy to do. Normal attack spam is the easiest to do and can be the best with a signature. Is any form of animation canceling recommended or even viable for him? I mean, yesn't. There's no real like jump cancels, obviously, because you can't jump during his skill, and there's no real combos that weave in dashes because his end lag on his attacks is very, very short, so it's faster to just go into your next attack than to dash to try to cancel something. There's no end lag to cancel, basically, right? The whole point of dash cancels is, well, if I do an attack that stays for long but that hits very early into the attack, I can dash out of it to cancel the end lag animation. It's already dealt damage, I'm still in animation. I don't want to be in animation, so I'm gonna dash. Wanderer doesn't stay into animation after dealing his damage. He's already ready for his next one. That being said, you can animation cancel your charge attack with a burst, kinda. You have to time it right to not lose the charge attack, but it can help you get like an additional charge attack while still getting your burst before you fall down, which if you have C2 is gonna matter a decent amount because it increases the damage of your burst a lot. Constellation overview. How is his Constellation quality across the board? How impactful is C1, 2, 4, and 6? And is his C2 good enough to warrant its price for particularly dedicated Wanderer players? Let's start with the last question. No, it is not. His C2 is not worth it. For a lot of players, his C2 is gonna feel worth it because C2 Wanderer takes, on average, between 250 and 300 wishes. C6 Faruzan, on average, takes around that amount as well. Basically, his C2 itself isn't that big of a deal, but it'll happen in terms of amount of wishes spent on the banner at around the same time as getting Faruzan C6, which is a big deal. C1 is decent. Like, it's nice, but C2 is basically nice for nuking like one wave or finishing off an enemy, and it does do a reasonable amount of damage. It's not a bad constellation at all. It's just not where the majority of his damage is coming from. C3 is the burst constellation. It's fine because the C2 synergizes with the C3, but it's nothing that insane. C4, what the fuck is this again? Oh yeah, you got a random buff, right? It's alright. If you get the cryo one, it's really nice, but building around the possibility of getting the cryo one means that your crit ratio is going to be scuffed, which means that when you don't get it, you're kind of hurting yourself more than you're helping yourself. So you generally still build just normally, even with this, and it's alright if it doesn't overcap on crit. Generally, most Wanderer teams will have him getting the Pyro one by default from the team, which means that this is either the Electro one, which I guess isn't that bad because of its synergy with C2, but even with the Electro one, it's if you don't have Electro units on your team, if you're playing his baseline Hyper team, you're not generating that much energy. So even with the Electro thing, you might still not get enough energy to burst every rotation, and getting 90% of your energy back is the same as getting 50% of your energy back. You're still only going to be able to burst every other rotation. It won't change the frequency at which you burst. So you have to be at very specific ER breakpoints for this to actually make a difference, and it's going to depend a lot on which team you're using. And because it only happens a third of the time, it's nice to have, but it's nothing crazy. Hydro 1 can be nice. It can help you deal with like one enemy that's left or the end of a wave, right? Same thing again, but it's a fine constellation. The C4, it's not terrible, but it's not insane. C5 is meh. Yes, his skill buffing his normal attack is the main way that he deals damage, but if you look at normal attack talent levels, right, it goes from, on the first hit, right, 126.2 to 135.8, right, from talents level 9 to 10, right, which is an increase of about 7.6% per talent level from 9 to 10. His skill, it goes from 151.2 to 153.7, which is an increase of about 1.7%. So basically, 3 levels on his skill is less than 1 level on his normal attack. His C3 is less impactful than Child's exploration passive. It's not completely useless. A 5% damage increase is still a thing, I guess. but it's not very good. And finally, C6, obviously, it's a strong constellation. It's kind of an average C6. It's not like Yelan, but it's also not like Child. Raiden, yeah, Raiden is another good example. But yeah, like it's a nice increase to his damage. And if you're playing him in hyper teams, it's going to be a pretty big increase to his team's DPS. All in all, he's got kind of okay. I'd say pretty average constellations. Not really below average, but not really above average either. Just okay. Team overview. What would I deem as his best archetypes? That's a difficult question to answer. If you don't have C6 Faruzan, there are 3-unit archetypes that are competitive with his 4-unit teams. And if you just slap him on to a team with those 3 other units, you could argue that's his best team. But like, that's not what you're asking with this question, right? Like, I'm gonna interpret this in a way where I don't have to just talk about Hyper Bloom Wanderer because I don't want to. His best archetype where he is played as actually a unit is his hyper archetype. There's no real reason to ever play him in other teams because he's just not going to do as good of a job as the other options that you have in stuff like Taser Team, stuff like Salad. You can play him in those teams if you want, and they can still perform well, but don't go for him if that's what you're intending on doing. You can play him in like freeze teams as well. I don't tend to like it. I know that some people do either freeze or like double cryo with him. I don't tend to like it. I think it's kind of scuffed, but it is a thing that you can do. In addition, how does he fare in this department over a more purpose-built driver / enabler like Sucrose or Hazo? As like a driver, he can be competitive with Hazo because Hazo's not really designed to be a good driver / buffer, but in teams where like you would call the on-field character a driver, right? Teams like Taser, teams like Hyper Bloom, he's not going to be better than Sucrose. Is a triple anemo comp ever advisable for him? The main thing about triple anemo is that you're playing either without Bennett or without a shielder. Very often, triple anemo comps will actually do more damage than his teams with Bennett and a shielder. They're just gonna be harder to play. But yes, a triple anemo comp when you're playing against enemies that you're not too scared of can be advisable. It's one of the very few teams where you can consider going for a crit Kazuha build rather than an EM Kazuha because you're not using Kazuha's EM to buff anyone because you've got 3 anemo units and Bennett, who cares about the pyro damage percent, and you're getting Faruzan buff, which increases the anemo part of Kazuha's damage. Another thing that is arguably a bit underrated is playing him with Venti. Similarly, you can also do crit Venti in a team like that. But, right, like I mentioned earlier, Wanderer's biggest weakness tends to be how he performs in AoE situations. Venti's pretty good at helping with that. How good is Moonglow for him? Oh man. I'll be nice and calc it for you. I have run the numbers. It is better than TTDS for his personal damage because it has base attack, and technically the passive does do some damage, I guess. It's worse than basically every other option, so just don't. What Wanderer name bestows the biggest damage bonus? It is Remy, just like the rat in Ratatouille, because just like Remy, Wanderer was, you know, inside of a bigger being controlling it, right? I just want to pay homage to my favorite mecha anime of all time, Ratatouille. Okay, like it's important to me. I love Ratatouille. Lastly, can I do some of his voice lines in both Japanese and English? Honestly, I don't feel like it today. I'm gonna be honest with you guys. I'm sorry. I'm tired. To all of you guys watching on YouTube, thank you for dropping by. I hope you had a great time watching. I hope you learned a thing or two if you had any questions. If there's something that I didn't end up mentioning that you are wondering about him, make sure to drop by on Twitch, twitch.tv/Zajef77. But yeah, I will see you guys around. Bye, YouTube.